No crime to be poor. From Easy Circumstances in A Bekkersdal Marathon by Herman Bosman. Poverty is no crime, Chris Velman declared. He declared it loudly, a shade aggressively, at the same time pushing the toe of his broken velskoen under his chair. Nor is it a matter of shame either, he added, to be poor. No, I don't care who knows that I'm not particularly rich myself, Atnodie remarked, withdrawing from general view a trouser turn-up that had been mended with string. Of course, it's not like I've been brought up poor. When my father tracked into these parts, coming up from the Cape, he was well-to-do. I won't say diamonds, and a sitting chair with blue curtains that you got carried around in, and such like, as they used to have in the old days in the Cape. No doubt my grandfather, in his time, would have been carried around in a sitting-up chair. But my father, when he came up from the Cape, why, we were just people in quite easy circumstances, that's all. Perhaps in the Transvaal, with a class of farmer living in the Transvaal then, I mean, we would have been thought to be rich even. So Chris Velman said yes, in the same way when his grandfather came up from the Cape. His grandfather was reckoned to be a man of no little affluence, especially so, perhaps, in comparison with what was the financial standing of the general run of Transvaal, then resident in the Transvaal. In fact, he wouldn't have been surprised if his grandfather had actually been carried up from the Cape into the Transvaal bushveld, sitting in one of those sitting-up chairs with blue curtains. Yes, I can quite believe it, Gijsbert van Tonder interjected, in a sarcastic voice. And it's easy to see that's what your nagmaal suit is patched with too. A piece of that same blue curtain. Well, I'm not exactly penniless today, and I don't care who knows it. Also, I was brought up poor, and I'm not ashamed of that either. So Yuri Stein said, well, there were different ways of making money, and he wasn't sure that it would meet with everybody's approval, the way some people made their money. At the same time, he couldn't but think that it was a strange thing how some people would talk about how well-to-do their forebears were, compared with the Transvaalers there that lived in reed and mud daub houses. After all, where did the Transvaalers that lived in reed and mud daub houses come from, if they didn't come from the Cape? He was sure he didn't know, Yuri Stein said. But what he would seek to deny about his own family when they came up from the Cape, Yuri Stein said, was that they enjoyed a greater than ordinary measure of prosperity. Compared with most of the Transvaalers, that was. No, I won't admit that I, myself, am a bit on the poor side today, Yuri Stein added, before Gijsbert van Tonder could make another interjection. And it's not that I'm ashamed of being poor either. There's nothing about it that I've got to try and hide. That was true enough. Shielded as his apparel was by the post office counter, there were no flaws in his garments that Yuri Stein needed to retire from the gaze of vulgar curiosity. Before the discussion grew acrimonious, however, Oupa Bekker began to relate an old Transvaal story that introduced a good many of the features we had already touched on. It was a story of a poor girl, Mimi de Jager, who lived with her parents in the Groot Moriku, in a kind of hartebeest house we had already been talking about. It was the kind of dwelling, Oupa Bekker started. You don't need to say that part of it again. We already know all that, Yuri Stein interjected. For Yuri Stein had noticed that Atnodeer was again surveying his voorkamer in a thoughtful manner. Very well, in that case, I'll say only that Mimi de Jager's parents did not exactly live in a palace. Oupa Bekker proceeded. Yes, Atnodeer nodded. I can imagine just the kind of hovel she stayed in. I must say, I think I've got a pretty good idea now, and I think the less said about it, the better. Thereupon Yuri Stein burst out that Atnodeer should be the last person to talk. If Mimi de Jager had ever seen Atnodeer's kitchen, and the kind of plates he ate out of, Yuri Stein said, then Mimi de Jager would feel, next to it, that her parents were rich people from the Cape, who had just arrived in sitting-up chairs. Yuri Stein talked as though he already knew what Mimi de Jager was like. Only after Gijsbert van Tonder had spoken at some length and in a sneering way, saying that for people who weren't ashamed of being poor, it was surprising how fussy some of us were. Was Oupa Bekker able to get on with his story? Mimi de Jager, Oupa Bekker said, lived with her parents in a plain house that was near the first sawmill they had in this part of the Transvaal. And one morning, when she was on her way home from the sawmill, good Lord, Chris Velman ejaculated suddenly. You don't mean to say that they were that poor? You don't mean she worked in the sawmill? Those heavy 30-foot logs? That's no work for a young girl with fair hair and dimples and sawing. It was apparent that Chris Velman had already formed a picture in his own mind of how Mimi de Jager looked. But Oupa Bekker said no. It was Mimi de Jager's father who worked in the sawmill. Mimi went there every morning to fetch firewood in a sack. And then one morning on her way home through the blue gums, Oupa Bekker continued, she saw a young man approaching along the path, a young man she didn't know. She guessed right away that he must be a son of the new people who had bought up the sawmill and the whole property. Rich people from the Cape they were.
So she let the sack of firewood fall from her shoulders quickly, and she hid the sack behind a blue gum. She did not mind the young man seeing her walking barefoot, but she did not want him to see her carrying that sack of wood. It went against her womanly pride. Not that she was ashamed of her parents being poor. No, no, we said. Poverty wasn't a crime, we said. But we had noticed Chris Velman hiding his broken velskoen. And we had seen what Atnodeer had done, furtively almost, with his trouser turn up a little earlier on. So we knew just how Mimi de Jager felt about that sack, a symbol of the fact that her parents were none too well off. She decided to walk straight on and past that young man. And then, after he was out of sight, she would go back and fetch the sack, Oupa Bekker said. But after she had passed the young man, keeping her eyes down on the ground as she passed him, and she turned round to see if he was out of sight yet, she saw that he had turned round to look at her. And when he saw her turning around, he thought, oh well, they were both young. And so they walked slowly towards each other. Mimi de Jager walking much more slowly than the young man, and blushing a good deal. And the young man said he was going to look at the sawmill his father had just bought. And Mimi said that she had come out for a walk through the blue gums and to pick yellow veld flowers. And they stood talking a long while in the pathway. And afterwards the girl said she had to go home. And then the young man said, oh, but what about her firewood? And he asked whether he could carry it home for her. And she said yes. And when she saw him lift the sack of firewood onto his broad young shoulders, she knew she would never need to carry a sack of firewood home again. Yuri Steyn wanted to know how Oupa Bekker knew all that, about what went on in Mimi de Jager's thoughts, Yuri Steyn said. She told me after we were married, Oupa Bekker answered. You see, I was that young man. It was my father who had just bought the sawmill. You must understand that when we came up from the Cape, my parents were in easy circumstances.